In this first History at Home video, we will highlight the primary and secondary sources you can use to find out more about the Potts family lives in 18th century Pottsgrove, alongside historical methods anyone can use to analyze the resources you come across when researching your family history.
Hello and greetings from Pottsgrove Manor, the home of the Potts family as well as the paid, indentured, and enslaved people who lived and worked here. The Potts were ironmasters and also the founders of modern-day Pottstown. But their family genealogy can certainly leave even the most experienced researcher scratching their heads, wondering which Thomas, John, Samuel, or Martha Potts they're reading about. So we want to talk about the family genealogy, what primary sources tell us about it, and give you some common tips and tricks to avoid some mishaps that you may encounter while doing your research. Now, first and foremost, we are talking about sources that are specific to the Potts family, but the methods that we're talking about will apply to almost any family genealogy. So let's first look at what the primary resources are. So those are sources that the Potts left behind or were available at the time the Potts were alive. Now here at Pottsgrove Manor, one of the most important resources that we utilize is the household ledger from 1751 to 53. And that gives us a fantastic window into both the everyday things the Potts are buying for the household, as well as the expensive luxury goods, and who's doing labor, who appears here, where the Potts are getting their resources from. And this is especially useful as it is in the time frame that they are moving in here at Pottsgrove Manor in 1752. At the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, there are the Potts family papers, and those are mostly business records the Potts have left behind. These papers are also available on microfilm at the Hagley Museum. So they're telling us about where the Potts are making money, how they're spending it, who they're interacting with, who's doing that work at their forges and furnaces. And so while they are business records, they certainly give us insight into how the family is operating not only the business, but those business contacts. Now, as for personal items the Potts have left behind, there are a few Potts pieces that we have here, but there's also some letters that John Potts has written, some at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and another at the American Philosophical Society. But John is not known for his penmanship, and these are quite difficult letters to read, but they are both about the French and Indian War and John writing to Conrad Weiser. Also telling us about life here at Pottsgrove Manor is the probate inventory and will after John Potts' death in 1768. Now, the probate inventory not only tells us what was in the household, but it also gives us the name of the 13 enslaved people who lived and worked here, 10 men and 3 women. They would have worked within the house and the surrounding area as well as residing here. The will of John Potts also gives us great insight into the family dynamics. John not only lists about how he wants property and assets to be controlled after his death, but by whom, but also how the money and the family dynamics work out after his death. Looking at some of the children of John and Ruth, they do often appear in Quaker meeting records, but there's also the papers of Jonathan Potts. He becomes a doctor and is in charge of the hospitals while the troops are at Valley Forge. And there are his papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. There's also a medical ledger book as well for his practice in Reading. And those are some really fantastic resources, especially if you want to know about his time within the American Army. Now, one of my favorite resources is newspapers, and because the Potts do appear several times in 18th century newspapers, whether that be advertising goods and businesses that they have, as well as kind of giving big family moments such as election to office, graduations, as well as obituaries. But the newspapers also give us insight into those who lived and worked for the Potts, as the Potts do place runaway advertisements for indentured and enslaved people who run away from forges and furnaces. And so the newspapers are a really wonderful resource for not only providing context for the world the Potts live in, but some specifics about how they ran their businesses and the family dynamics. Following primary sources, and by no means is this list of primary sources an exhaustive list, just some really kind of great ones for starting your 18th century Potts research. There are also secondary sources, so people who have already done research or written about the Potts family. Now, our oldest resource is the Memorial of Thomas Potts Jr. by Mrs. Thomas Potts James, or the Mrs. James Genealogy, which is what I'll call it throughout the rest of this video. Now, the Mrs. James Genealogy was first published in 1874 and is a prime example of the popularity of amateur genealogies that were done in the late Victorian period. Now, Mrs. James tells some wonderful family stories. However, she does get things that are incorrect, and she does get confused sometimes about which Potts she's referencing. And unfortunately, as is very common practice for these 19th century genealogies, there's really no footnotes or notes about where source information is coming from. And so the Mrs. James Genealogy is a great kind of roadmap into finding out more about the Potts stories. However, it's not the greatest resource for finding fact. Now, this hefty resource is the historical collections relating to the Potts family in Great Britain and North America, and it is published in 1901. And one of the favorite things I like about this is it distinguishes more than just one branch of the Potts family, but tells you about several different ones because they can be confusing. Now, again, this is an older source, so it doesn't have a lot of, again, footnotes about where source information is coming from. But one thing it does do is help clear up some confusion about which Thomas Potts first immigrated to the Pennsylvania area, because there are at least 3 who immigrated in the late 17th century. So there's one who went aboard the ship, the Shield, and that's the one that Mrs. James says is our Thomas Potts, but unfortunately she's incorrect about that. That Thomas Potts eventually apparently settled in New Jersey. There's also a Thomas Potts who was in Philadelphia by 1686, and he is a miller, and this book calls him Thomas Potts Miller. And then finally, there's our Thomas Potts, who's referenced as Thomas Potts Jr. or Thomas Potts Colebrookdale, as he got involved in the iron industry. And that is the Thomas Potts for our branch of the Potts family. Another great secondary source is the dissertation by Linda McCurdy, which was published in 1974. So again, a bit of an older source, but she gives us great insight into the Potts businesses.
And my favorite thing about Linda McCurdy's dissertation are the thorough footnotes and the maps, charts, and images found throughout her work.
There's also information published about the 7th son, Jonathan, our family doctor, called Physician of the American Revolution. However, that is out of print, so you're likely going to need to find that in your local library. But that gives information about Jonathan Potts, his time, especially during the American Revolution at Fort Ticonderoga, and then later at Valley Forge until the end of his life in 1783. There's also the research of good friend of Pottsgrove Manor, Dan Graham. He's an author on many different pieces about the Potts family and has spoken here about his research before. Now, you can find his research on genealogy about the Potts family on our website, and there's also a fantastic list of many primary and secondary places that he gets his sources from, and is very interested in the 3rd child, John Jr. Now, we mentioned that it's easy to get confused when you're doing research about the Potts family, whether that be because you're researching people who have similar names or a junior, senior, or have the same last name Potts, but aren't related to the family. And so my advice is to make sure you take detailed notes and citations. You always want to make sure you know where you got your information from. And so if you do get confused about which person you're talking about, you can easily go back and reference it. I also say make a very conscious effort to include those junior, senior titles, or a middle name, or for women, maiden names. Now, it sometimes can be difficult in doing women's history because as women got married, they changed their last name. So unless you have a resource telling you what that maiden name was, you may not be able to find out information about the matrilineal side. However, again, detailed notes and citations not only allow other people to know that your research is credible and be able to find that same information that you did, it also allows you to go back. If you find out something that changes your picture about your interpretation, you can easily go back and find that original source. All right, so we've gathered our primary and secondary resources, and it's also time to pull out our historian's toolkit so we can best analyze what our sources are telling us. Now, first, a little family history. Now, we mentioned that there are several different Thomas Potts who immigrated to the Pennsylvania area near the end of the 17th century. And the Thomas Potts for our family immigrated to the Germantown area in 1698 from Wales. John is born in about 1710, but a big change comes to the family when his mother, Martha Curlis Potts, passes away, and by 1717, Thomas has remarried a Magdalene Robeson. And the family relocates to this area along the Manitou region, and Thomas becomes the manager of the Colebrookdale furnace. Now, this really starts to cement the Potts' climb in the iron industry, and John is able to follow in his father's footsteps and helps make the Potts family the leading iron masters in 18th century Pennsylvania. The family moves from managing to being owners because of John's marriage to Ruth Savage. Their wedding certificate is a fantastic primary source because not only does it tell us when they were married in 1734, but it's also the who's who of the iron industry, as friends and family all signed the marriage certificate because John and Ruth were married in a Quaker-style ceremony. And so we really get an insight into who's important to this family, who's been invited, who's there. Now, from John and Ruth's marriage, they have 13 children, and all 13 live to be adults. But there are 25 years between the oldest, a son named Thomas, and the youngest, a daughter named Ruth. Now, these children go many different ways, but most of them get involved in the iron business or marry iron masters themselves. But there are also people who go different careers, such as John Potts Jr. and Jonathan Potts, who become a lawyer and doctor respectively. The children are also heavily involved in the growing town of Pottstown, whether that be in the leadership or running businesses, such as being a miller or running a tannery. But the children, one way or another, always help to promote the Potts name, whether that be in status or finances. The children then give John and Ruth 74 grandkids and close to 200 great-grandkids. Now here at Pottsgrove Manor, we really focus on the story of John, Ruth, and those 13 children, as well as the people who lived and worked here, the paid, indentured, and enslaved laborers. We really focus on their life here at Pottsgrove Manor. But that's actually not a huge time frame. The house was built in 1752, but it's out of the family hands by 1783. So really only 30 years the Potts have lived here. All right, so we have our basic family history now to guide us. So when you're doing your research about the Potts family, one of the best things that you can do is have a mindset of question everything. And this is especially helpful when going through your secondary sources. So who wrote this? Why did they write it? Is this true? Where's their source? This is going to help you make sure you maintain an accurate portrayal from what the sources themselves tell us about the Potts family. Now, this is helpful if you're going through older research that maybe doesn't have the best practices or haven't cited their information, or it's something you find on the internet that isn't the greatest source. Make sure you question it before including it in your own research, or make sure you note that. It's okay if something confuses you, but you want to include it in your notes. Just make sure that you include a note about where it came from and your questions about it. Now, you shouldn't just question secondary sources, you should also question your primary resources, but they help us kind of open up the door to even more questions and possible answers. So for a primary source, who wrote this? What was their motivation? Is there something missing that I don't understand about this source? So slightly different questions that are aimed at kind of opening up the way that we look at our sources. So let's do an example of that using my favorite source, the household ledger for the Potts. And so what is this source? Well, it's all about the things the Potts buy for the household. It's a list of things that they purchase, how much, where their money's going, who picked it up, and when. We know that it's from 1751 to 53 because everything's dated in there. So the question kind of comes, all right, who wrote this? Who's interacting with it? And that's going to be Thomas York, the brother-in-law of John Potts and the clerk. And we know this because he signs it, but there's also references in how he writes, such as, bought for your wife or for your son. But there's also times when he references debt that John Potts pays for him or paid your draught on me. And one of the most important questions we can ask of our primary sources is, of course, what can this tell us about the lives of the people it mentions? And so for the household ledger, if we combine that context that we already know about the Potts, such as they have just moved in here, the family already has 10 children born, another 3 are yet to come. And so when we look at these purchases, a lot of them are very much the household goods. We see pins and linen, and we see food that are coming in, from oatmeal and raisins all the way up to really expensive specialty items such as sugar, tea, chocolate, lots of alcohol as well. We also see that Ruth is certainly setting up home, as there are sometimes some massive purchases that she makes and has delivered that include some of these luxury goods and sometimes silks and everything, but also include everyday items such as a tea set or a kettle. We also get a glimpse into family activities. We see lots of tuition payments for some of the boys as they're heading off to the Philadelphia Academy, as well as some of the things that they're buying. Lots of shoes, stockings, as well as, some specialty things, such as a book on navigation. But for the girls, we also see that Martha is in charge of a lot of things and fetching for her mom, but she also seems to be a small little fashionista and gets a lot of really cute hats and has a dress made and stuff. So when we ask, what can this tell us about the Potts? Our primary source tells us a lot about the everyday lives, but it also tells us how the Potts interact with those who lived and worked in the house, because they tend to not show up all that much, but they're critical in running the house. We do sometimes see payments for indentured servants and the ways that enslaved people were also sent around the Iron Empire that the Potts have, whether it be running errands or doing different work for the Potts, not only at the household, but at other locations of forges and furnaces. When we think of the Potts living here at Pottsgrove Manor and their lives in the growing town of Pottstown, they are not alone. And so we see the people who lived and worked here and helped build the Potts' wealth through their exploited labor. Their names appear in Potts records, the household ledger, the Pottsgrove ledger for the town, as well as the forges here, the will of John Potts, and in newspapers when some run away. And we cannot overlook any of these sources to help us build an accurate picture of what life was like both as a Potts and for the people who lived and worked here. And we cannot understand the Potts family without thinking about the people who made their wealth happen. So again, it's time to look at our sources and what our sources tell us about their lives. But again, it might be a source that the Potts themselves left behind, so we need to ask it some slightly different questions. So essentially trying to flip the record on its head and asking questions about who it was written about rather than who it was written by. It's through asking questions of our sources like this that we get a better understanding of the people it talks about. Genealogy is the tracing of the family, who, is related to whom. But it's also a way that we open doors in a better understanding of those who came before us. I also want to encourage you to read well-researched and scholarly books about anything and everything in the 18th century, because that'll help build your background knowledge about this time period and will impact about how you interpret the sources the Potts have left behind. Building your own background knowledge can help shape and strengthen your interpretation from these sources and the lives of the people who appear in the documents. For example, reading a women's history book can help emphasize the importance of courtship and how seriously women took marriage in upper-class families like the Potts, and how choosing a husband, and especially picking one that was from a similar background as your own, made sure that you probably knew the life you were signing up for. So that helps us kind of shape our knowledge about Martha and Anna Potts, the oldest two daughters who married into the iron industry. And so using information from a women's history book really helps kind of shape your understanding about their lives, how they have chosen a life that they probably knew. They knew what they were signing up for. And so marrying a person within the iron industry probably also meant that they knew that person growing up. Outside research helps shape the stories that we tell, and they change how we view sources that we have always known about. The stories that our sources tell us about the Potts family are always going to be more interesting, but more importantly, they give us an accurate window into their lives. These sources are always being interpreted by other researchers and historians, and when we uncover more sources of information, they can impact how we view everything. What remains, though, is the importance of letting those sources the Potts have left behind tell us about their lives and their actions. Well-researched information about the Potts helps shape our understanding of them as humans. They're people, they're a family, just like any family today. They're complicated and sometimes hard to fully know, but they still speak to us through the things that they have left behind, whether they be documents or objects. It's just up to us to continuously listen and interpret to keep forming an accurate picture of their lives.